All right, good morning all. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I lead the Data and Analytics Services group at NERSC, which is Berkeley Lab Supercomputing Center. Over the last 5 years or so, words like big data, AI, cognitive computing have become the rage, and we work in science, and we've been thinking really hard about what do these words mean for us. Is big data relevant to the world of science? Is AI relevant? Is machine learning relevant? So in this talk, what I'm going to do is to essentially take you on a tour of some of the hardest challenges that we have in science and why big data and machine learning and statistics are more relevant than ever. Before I jump into, the title of my talk is on the top 10 data analytics problems in science. But before I get there, I sort of need to prepare you. I mean, just give you a little bit of context into what we do at NERSC and DOE in sciences, why the nature of science is changing. So historically, we used to do a lot of high-performance computing simulations, but now we look at analysis problems, and then we'll get at the analytics problems, and then, in fact, just take a step back, think about what's common to various analytics problems, and what do we do in terms of a strategy in big data. So Berkeley Lab is right next to UC Berkeley campus. So if you just look up in this direction, you'll see the advanced light source. Berkeley Lab is the premier research laboratory in the Department of Energy. Can we cut down the lights maybe a little bit? So NERSC, the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center, is Berkeley Lab's supercomputing center. This is a new building called the Wang Hall. It was just, well, we moved into this building earlier in the year. And this houses a number of supercomputers, which will show shortly. The DOE, so you may know that, I mean, a lot of you might be funded by the NSF. The DOE is the largest funder of physical sciences research in the US. And if you look at the kinds of activities that we undertake in the DOE, we work across a gamut of problems. So problems in the biological and environmental sciences, problems in particle physics and astrophysics, nuclear physics, fusion, plasma physics, materials chemistry, geophysics. When it comes to methods and computer science, the two areas that we are known for are applied mathematics and essentially high-performance computing. So in applied math, we have a long, multi-decadal background in creating PDEs, solving PDEs at scale, simulating natural phenomena of interest. On the computing side, DOE has essentially owned the petascale mission and will own the exascale mission going forward. So NERSC is the production HPC and data facility for the Department of Energy. Science is something that we care about deeply. We're not here to make money. We are essentially funded by taxpayers. So we support the broad mission requirements of the 6 DOE Office of Science programs. I walked you through those 6 areas in the last slide. We have about 6,000 users, which is a fairly large number. So in the DOE, we really do understand what our users need. And there are over 750 unique projects that we have. We conduct extensive science engagement and user training programs. One way to measure the productivity of science is through publications. And every year we generate around 2,000 publications in top-tier venues. This is what NERSC looks like as of this year. So at any point in time, we have 2 big supercomputers on the floor. So at this point in time, we have the Edison Cray XE30 system, and then the new Cori Cray XE40 system. Both of these machines are multi-petaflop systems. The fonts are a little slow, but essentially they have hundreds of terabytes of memory and hundreds of thousands of cores. So again, historically, these kinds of systems have been very good at running HPC simulations at scale. But in the data world, it's not just about running compute fast. You do have to think about the I/O. You have to get the data to the machine. So there are a number of high-performance file systems that we have. So both of these systems have the Lustre file system. There are slower file systems, GPFS off to the side, which are multi-petabyte in size. I/O is a big problem in the data space. The technology is just not keeping pace with the speed of compute and memory. Amongst the few technical options that we have is something called SSDs. So we have now deployed a technology called the burst buffer, which is essentially a globally shared pool of SSD memory that's about 1.5 petabytes in size. And the I/O rates that pool can sustain is about 1.5 terabytes a second. So we think that that will be reasonable in terms of supporting data-centric workloads. You may, of course, move the data from a file system to the machine, but then chances are that your data is somewhere remote. So how do we move data from outside a supercomputing center to a place like NERSC? So Berkeley Lab has the Energy Sciences Network, and they specialize in deploying 100 gig and now terabit networking technologies purely for science. So Corey, NERSC is taking an unusual stance in that we're saying that a single system can do a good job at supporting both HPC and data-centric workloads. So Corey is our bet. This is a Cray XE40 system. Phase one of the system, which is the Haswell chipset, has been working for the last year or so. And phase two, the Knight's Landing system, is now going to be deployed shortly. Getting the hardware up and running is something we know how to do. I think software is really where the big challenge is. And in the data space, part of my group, our challenge is to determine what is the right portfolio of tools to present to our 6,000 users. So when you think about data, we're going to be chatting about data analytics, and I suspect that a lot of you are methods researchers, and maybe this is the only row that you care about. How do you develop your methods in a tool like Python or R or Spark and get it up and running? But you have to keep in mind that that data is a broad ecosystem. So you have to think about how your data is stored, what the right data management technologies are, how do you move your data from one supercomputing center to the other, how do you access it? So data doesn't go to a supercomputing center to die. Chances are that you'll analyze it and you'll share it with the rest of the community. So how do you make that data accessible to the broader scientific community? With terabyte, 10 terabyte, 100 terabyte size data sets, it's unlikely that you're going to be doing the processing by hand. Chances are that you'll need to automate the analysis. So workflows are a key technology that enables that. Analytics, again, I'm going to touch on that shortly. So both statistics and machine learning are absolutely key. So is imaging. And finally, visualization. You typically do want to see the raw data, the results of the analysis. So we think about both scientific and information visualization. And there are a host of technologies that we think about and deploy at a place like NERSC. So this is one attempt at characterizing what the production stack looks like at NERSC at this point in time. So broadly, when analytics users come to us, they would like to do some statistics, machine learning, image processing, graph analytics, or they just want to do old-fashioned database queries. So our user-facing libraries are, R, Python, Spark is an interface called MLBase. MATLAB is still around, still quite commonly used by researchers. Graph analytics, I think the space is in flux at this point in time. There are a number of options. And then, of course, people use SQL all the time. So anyway, so we do try to make sure that the user-facing tools are easy. But everything from there on down, what is the runtime framework? How does the runtime framework understand the file system, the batch system, and then how does that in turn utilize the hardware? Those are all details that we work on. We work on those with the industry, with Cray, Intel, and other partners. All right, so this is a cartoon. I think as I think about the data community, maybe 2-3 years from now, I think in steady state, it's going to settle down to a curve like this. So on the y-axis are number of users, and then on the x-axis are problems that you might want to solve at a certain scale. So maybe you want to solve a terabyte-sized problem with 1,000 cores, 10 terabytes at 10,000 cores, 100 terabytes at 100,000 cores, and a petabyte at maybe 1 million cores. These are not fictional numbers. We do have machines now that have 1 million cores available. The Department of Energy and DoD almost certainly span this entire spectrum. So we have problems at all scales. I think NSF and NASA might be one step behind. But this curve is certainly moving to the right. Data sets are getting larger and larger, and you need to run analytics at scale. I would say that at this point in time, you can solve a terabyte-sized problems on 1,000 cores. That's doable. Technologies like Python, R, Spark do scale. 10 terabytes, 10,000 cores, we are getting there. So we have a joint project with Michael Mahoney, Alex, Cray, Intel, where we are scaling Spark to run on big systems. Python R have challenges, but we'll get there. But really, I think the problems are going to be at this scale. If you wanted to process 100 terabytes of data on 100,000 cores, how would you do it? Would you fall back to CMPI Fortran? If you wanted to process a petabyte of data on 1 million cores, what would be the right runtime framework? What would be the right programming language? So anyway, so those are key challenges that are important for us in the DOE. If those problems are of interest to you, please let me know as well. So technical challenges, I think, on this side of the spectrum are really quite key. I will note that if you had a problem that was just a terabyte, you could solve it maybe on your laptop or in the cloud. If you had a problem at this scale, I think the cloud would be just fine as well. It's really on the right side where there are what we call capability applications that can only be solved by using a big HPC machine. So that's the reason why DOE spends a lot of money on big HPC centers, and the right side of the spectrum is really what we try to enable. All right, so that's a lot of background in technology, the hardware. Now I want to talk about science and how science is changing. So again, places like DOE, we've done high-performance computing for a long time, and climate is sort of a surrogate application for that. But what's changed in the last 5 or so years for us is that we are now starting to see a data deluge from a lot of experimental and observational data sources. So the fields for example, in astronomy, folks use telescopes all the time. There are genome sequences which are used. Physics has a number of high-energy experiments that are deployed all over the world, and then light sources. So I just want to walk you through a gallery of images just to give you a sense for what these instruments are and what they're capable of. So in astronomy in particular, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey has been the workhorse for the last decade or so. This is an image of the Palomar Trains Factory, which is in Southern California. This is an image of the dark energy spectroscopic instrument. All of these telescopes can produce 10 gigabytes of data every night. And then depending on where this instrument is, data can be streamed over a wireless connection or through a landline to a place like NERSC where it's analyzed. The big project in astronomy, of course, is the LSST, the Large Scale Synoptic Telescope. And every night, this particular instrument is going to be capable of processing 100 terabytes of data. Over the lifetime of its deployment, we will have 100 petabytes of data to analyze. So, should all of that data be moved from a mountaintop in Chile to the US? Should some of the processing be done in situ? There are a lot of interesting technical challenges here. But of course, this will facilitate a number of interesting science goals, I think, over the years. This is an image of the light source. So just as the Campanile is the landmark building for UC Berkeley, the light source is the landmark building for the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. If you look inside one of these light sources, you essentially see an electromagnet. So this is the roof, and you see the electromagnet here. Particles are accelerated to very high velocities. And essentially then scientists set up an array of beamlines. So the particles exit tangentially to the light source. And scientists set up a host of various customized instruments so that maybe as your particles come in this way, they stage a sample, a particular material. They rotate the material and keep acquiring images one after the other. So you might have maybe tens of gigabytes of data. You have a sequence of images, and then the question you want to ask is, what is this material that I was trying to image? In genomics, the Joint Genome Institute, which is a DOE facility based in Walnut Creek, essentially it has arrays of Illumina sequencers. Every day, they send data to NERSC. There are canned pipelines that run. In a week or so, we get about a terabyte or slightly more of data. So certainly, I think the field of genomics has pretty much become very much production oriented at this point in time. In high-energy physics, this is an image of the Diabei detector, which is in China. So there's an underground mine. There's a tank, a swimming pool with some liquid in it. And then physicists have designed these sensors and they immerse these sensors in these tanks. If you look inside one of these tanks, there are arrays of photosensitive receptors that can detect particles at the nanosecond level of precision. So you might have neutrinos maybe that stream through the universe. They react with the substance in this tank, and then the products of that reaction can be picked up by these sensors. So over the lifetime of one of these projects, you can get about 200, 250 terabytes of data. This is an image of the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory. The recent physics prize, the Nobel Prize in Physics, was attributed to this particular detector. The grandest instrument in physics, and one of my earlier colleagues, Yushu Yao here, worked on some of these projects. So the grandest instrument, of course, is the Large Hadron Collider in CERN. So for scale, that's a person standing there. At its raw rate, the instrument, so one of these detectors, can produce a petabyte in a second. There is, of course, no piece of computer technology that can keep up with those data rates. So it's really important that you cut that number down to something that's a little more manageable. So essentially what physicists do is to encode pattern detection logic in FPGAs around these detectors, and then they reduce the data volume by 6 orders of magnitude, get it down to a gigabyte a second, and then read the data off. But even then, the LHC, the footprint of the LHC worldwide is about a petabyte or more. The LHC will now soon undertake a series of instruments in what is called the high luminosity mode, which is going to produce data at the order of 10 petabytes a second. So anyway, so the physicists have their hands full. So so hopefully you get a sense for where all of this data is coming from. So it's no longer the case that the supercomputer is the sole source of data. It's all of these array of amazing instruments that scientists have been working on for a while, and they're easily capable of producing large amounts of data. So the 5 V's of big data have been used to characterize the problem landscape, and I've taken an attempt in characterizing the landscape for scientific big data. So the 4 V's, so I would say that the 5th V is value for us. We're not in business of monetizing user behavior. The kinds of questions that we care about are a little more altruistic in nature. So the 4 V's that we care about are variety, volume, velocity, and veracity. In terms of variety, when you think about astronomy, telescopes can image data in multiple bands, multiple spectra. So can light sources. There are various flavors of genome sequencers that one can deploy. Volume, again, I would say that anywhere from hundreds of gigabytes of data to petabytes are being produced routinely at this point in time. The velocity aspect, I would say that there's certainly an infrastructure issue concerned with velocity. How do you connect a light source to a supercomputer? If you are on a mountaintop in Chile, then how do you get that data out? So anyway, so there are some aspects of streaming data. The veracity aspect, and I think the reason that I'm here today giving this talk is because historically, when you think about climate and high-performance computing simulations, there is some variety aspect to that. It's multivariate, it's complex, there is a large data component to it. But roughly speaking, climate data is clean. There's no missing data, there's really no noise. The reason why the fields of statistics and machine learning have become more relevant to DOE now as opposed to maybe 5 years back is because, of course, anytime you take a real measurement, there's going to be noise. There are going to be acquisition artifacts. And how do you solve inference problems or pattern detection problems in the presence of noise? The fields of statistics and machine learning are really the disciplines that give you a principled answer to those questions. So anyway, accounting for veracity and conducting inference on a sound footing is really why DOE is starting to care about stat and machine learning now. So as you think about the problems that I'm going to present next, just keep in mind the large volume aspect, but also the fact that this data is complex and noisy. All right, so I'll get to the top 10 problems now. And clearly there is a selection bias. I mean, I talk to a lot of scientists. I talk to a few dozen scientists, I keep track of a few dozen science areas. Maybe I talk to hundreds of scientists. So I try to pick and choose problems which, there's a big science problem that you want to solve at the end of the day, but then there's also a beautiful stat or machine learning problem. And then there is a nice scale challenge which really justifies running on a big HPC machine. So one of the unique things about Berkeley Lab is that we work on problems at all scales in science. So as we walk through this list, we'll start off at the scale of the entire universe, and then we'll go all the way down to subatomic physics. So we'll start with problem number 1, which is my personal favorite, which is essentially to create a catalog of all objects in the universe. The way telescopes work right now is that you take the SDSS instrument, you point it at the sky, you collect images, and then you try to create a list of objects. So, here's a star, here's a galaxy, so on and so forth. Now you deploy the Palomar Engine Factory, it's the first time that anyone's ever pointed an instrument at the sky. You create yet another catalog. Tomorrow, the LSST is going to do the same. Well, you're looking at the same sky at the end of the day, so you really should be able to borrow strength across these multiple surveys and infer one unified catalog. So what we have done in collaboration with John McAuliffe in the statistics department here, and Jeff Regier, who's going to be on the job market shortly. So there are folks from UC Berkeley and Harvard on this team, and of course physicists from the lab. We've essentially created a generative model for the universe. So we've created a graphical model which captures properties of stars, properties of galaxies, the latent variables, the relationships between them, and then how they would result in a certain CCD count on your, in a certain photon count on your CCD array. Every single node, every single arc, every dependency has essentially been signed off by a physicist. So it's taken us 2 years to develop this graphical model. Choices of the functional form of the hyperparameter distributions, all of those have been signed off by the physicists as well. So anyway, Jeff Regier pursued this for his PhD thesis. We've been really fortunate to have him. So this, to my knowledge, this is the largest graphical model problem in science. Certainly there are billions of parameters to solve for. So again, keep in mind that all you observe are the photon counts on your CCD array. And what you need to do is to determine what the parameter settings are for galaxies and stars and so on and so forth. So several billion parameters to solve. If you think about it in terms of a graph, tens of millions of vertices, many millions of edges. I'm told that, so we have a Berkeley camp and we have a Harvard camp, and the Berkeley camp believes that variational inference is really the only method that can operate at this scale. And in particular, stochastic techniques for solving variational inference at this scale are the ones that are going to save the day. So we have those coded up, and indeed, we are getting better results than the baseline methods that the physicists have been using so far. And then we have a Harvard camp that's believes in designing MCMC chains and getting those to converge. So that project is coming along as well, and we are starting to see some promising results. So we have papers in ICML and NIPS, and again, the hope is that we've applied this method, this approach to SDSS data, but shortly we're going to apply it to another telescope and really fuse it and get one catalog out. Now, you have to keep in mind that not only, of course, do you derive parameter estimates for each of these settings. So, I can compute where the star is in the sky, what redshift, what's its temperature, brightness, all of its physical parameters. But I can also determine the uncertainty, the confidence that I have in my estimates. Those estimates are then used by follow-up spectroscopy studies. So I showed you an image of the dark energy spectroscopic instrument. Essentially what that telescope is an array of programmable fiber optics that can be programmed to look at very specific points in the sky. So we use the uncertainty estimates from the graphical model to determine where to do follow-up studies from. All right, so not only, of course, can we look at the entire universe using telescopes, but we can also simulate the universe, and this has been a historical strength of the DOE. So in cosmology, there are maybe 4 or 5 numbers that cosmologists use to characterize the universe. So we parameterize dark energy, dark matter with a few numbers. We plug in those numbers, we initialize the universe, and then we run the simulation out for 16.7 billion years, which is the present day of the universe. So you get a certain distribution of dark matter in the universe. Now the question arises, well, so we plugged in those numbers. Are those numbers right, wrong? How do we compare distribution of mass in this simulated universe to what we observe through telescopes? So what's key here is that we be able to compute some summary statistics from this large simulation and compare those summary statistics to observational data. So doing some clustering analysis, doing 2-point correlation, doing 3-point correlation are all key challenges. So I can compute those for a trillion particle simulation. So right now, DOE is at the scale where we can simulate a trillion or about 10 trillion particles. And fortunately, in this case, at least the dimensionality of each data point is relatively small. So it's about six dimensional. So doing clustering or 2-point or 3-point correlation analysis on a trillion particles, that's the challenge. But if one could do that, then one could, of course, compute the same summary statistics from telescope data and then see if those line up. If they don't, then you sort of have an interesting design of experiment problem in that perhaps the 4 or 5 numbers that I put in to characterize cosmology need to be tweaked. And then I essentially run a 10 million core hour simulation yet again. So there are challenges associated with design of experiments, but also computing summary statistics. Fortunately, there is some progress. So at least on the clustering side, we worked with Intel and we've applied the DB scan algorithm to a trillion particle data set. So for a trillion particle data set, each time step is about 30 terabytes. And we can do this clustering on 100,000 cores in tens of minutes. All right, so from simulations of the universe, unfortunately, the DOE doesn't quite care about the Milky Way or our solar system. We come down to Earth. So the climate system is something that the DOE cares about deeply. Understanding how Earth's climate might change in the future is important. Discussions pertaining to climate change tend to be fairly simplistic. So we talk about, when you talk about IPCC graphs and so on, you talk about annual global means. So essentially you take a 3D, so climate data has 1 million grid points and you might have 30 vertical levels. You compress it all down to a single number and not just for a single time instant, but for the entire year. And then you look for trends in that number, in that global mean temperature. Or you look for sea level rise and you try to make some statements about how the climate might, the global mean temperature or sea level might change in the future. Scientists are now climate scientists are now starting to ask more sophisticated questions. So I think all of you may remember Hurricane Katrina and the amount of damage that it did when it made landfall in New Orleans. You may recall Hurricane Evans and when it hit New York. Each of these events are billion-dollar events. They cause that much damage, if not more. And certainly it takes the regional economy and the global and the national economy a while to recover from such events. So the problem here is if we think about such extreme events, hurricanes, atmospheric rivers, extratropical cyclones, so on and so forth, how do we expect the intensity and the frequency of such events to change in the future? If you could apply some pattern detection technology for extracting these events from large climate simulations, then you could look for changes or trends in these events. So there's actually a very direct analogy to activity detection in video. So people look for cat faces and so on and so forth in YouTube video. The problem is roughly the same. You have an image that has 1 million grid points. Of course, we don't have RGB channels at each point. We have 30 or so variables, and the variables may be temperature, pressure, precipitation, so on and so forth. And now you are looking for a hurricane, which is a system that's spinning and has a characteristic shape. So we've been looking at this problem now, and again, climate scientists have been very ad hoc in the way they express patterns. So a scientist will come up with some, their own definition of, okay, if I only apply a certain temperature condition and then a certain pressure condition, and if all of those are satisfied, we'll declare it to be a hurricane. So sometimes there is consensus in the field on these thresholds, but sometimes there isn't. So we've been applying deep learning for some ground truth data that we have on hand. And sure enough, similar to the empirical success being reported for deep learning in other domains, we are able to train these algorithms and have them successfully find hurricanes with 95% plus accuracy. So that's coming along. I'll note that the multivariate threshold-based conditions, we have now developed massively parallel map-reduced style implementations of such methods to the extent that we can process 5 petabyte sized data set on 750,000 cores on a BGQ system in 1 hour, things which are just not possible earlier. All right, so moving from that to knowledge extraction. And I think this is a problem that we all collectively contribute to, in that we're all very productive. There are just so many venues to publish these days that it's become impossible for people to keep track of where the frontier of the field might be. Should one be in an unfortunate situation where you need to search for or know the most promising cure for a certain disease, what are the options that are available to you? You log on to pubmed.nih.gov and you look for, do a keyword search. When students write, the related work sections in their papers, you're so biased by your group or your PhD advisor that you might unintentionally not cover ideas that are out there in the field. So really, I think it's time that technologies like Watson, and there are some other open source technologies being developed at Stanford, like Deep Dive and others, that we turn those loose to collections of scientific data sets. Choose a domain, choose genomics, choose geology, whatever it is. Let these tools loose. I mean, almost certainly you'll have to adapt the taxonomy to domain-specific language. But once you've done that, then you really should be able to apply these systems and extract a knowledge base and understand the knowledge base will have entities at each node, and relationships would be captured by publications. So really, once you are an end user, you could be a scientist, you could be a grad student, you could be a person suffering from a disease. You should be able to ask a question. For example, if you're a researcher, is gene X related to gene Y? And the system should be able to come back to you saying, yes, 95% confidence, and by the way, these are the top 5 papers that show that link in published literature. So anyway, so I think, of course, the Watson people are applying the technology to healthcare. Chris Ray, who I think you're going to be hearing from tomorrow, has applied it to a few domain sciences. But I think we're at the right point in time wherein we have the data, we have the technology, and it's just a matter of connecting the dots at this point. All right, so I'll move on to individuals and neuroscience in particular, functioning of an organ. The Brain Initiative has, I think, created a renaissance in the field of neuroscience in the last 5 years. The Human Brain Project, of course, predates that. There's a lot of efforts in the EU on how to create simulations which are data-driven in nature. The US Brain Initiative seems to be a little more, we're going to record data from the brain, and let's see what that tells us. So a particular problem that we are thinking of at the lab, and again, this is a very, very broad space. You really can't do justice to neuroscience in one slide or in one problem. But one particular problem that we are interested in collaboration with UCSF, is on speech synthesis. So what we are trying to do is to create, I guess what I like to call is the Stephen Hawking device. Brain control, BCI interfaces have certainly evolved to an extent wherein you can control a robotic grasp just by thinking. We can decode brain activity and decode the XYZ and the angle positions of an end effector. What we're trying to do here is to decode speech. So in UCSF, there is an amazing data set wherein they have people come in, they implant a chip on their brain and essentially have them speak Alice in Wonderland. And of course they put the chip on the area of the brain that's responsible for speech planning. So essentially you have raw data, the spike train data that's being recorded from these electrodes, but then also the output signal, the consonant, vowels, words, speech that's being tagged. So now so we have the input and output data. If we could only learn the mapping, then we could apply the mapping to perhaps a patient who has lost control of their speech. So that's why we call it the Stephen Hawking device, in that there is a person whose brain is active, but they cannot control their speech anymore. So, so the data exists, and we have, again, in collaboration with folks at the Redwood Center and UCSF, demonstrated state-of-the-art decoding with deep learning. This is, I think, going to be more and more, the figure on the right here, a template for data-driven projects. You have an experimental device, so maybe an ECOG array or an e-chip that's co-located at a certain medical facility. There might be some in situ real-time processing that happens. So again, DARPA has a number of calls in real-time feedback control. So there might be an FPGA or some stimuli that's being prepared. But then a parallel data stream goes off to the cloud, or it might go off to a place like NERSC. And then over there, you're essentially building a repository of recordings. You have data management technologies which help another scientist from another part of the world make sense of the data. But more importantly, you have parallelized statistical algorithms, so that maybe you just come in through a web front end. So crcns.org is a particular front end that folks at the Redwood Center have been developing for a while. You come in, and not only can you browse what data sets are now available, but also launch analytics tasks through a Jupyter or an IPython notebook. And because there are parallelized statistical algorithms which are available to you, the end user, don't really have to think about parallelizing algorithms or the details of how this HPC system might interact with the data repository. So anyway, so we think that this is a really powerful concept going forward. Neuroscience, again, a lot of funding is going into neuroscience, but it's certainly a community that is struggling with data management and data sharing issues at this point in time. So we're trying to do all we can to help them out. All right, so moving from functions of organs to functions of a cell. Berkeley Lab, again, is unique in that we have imaging instruments that can image data, again, at many spectra, but also spatially at many different scales. So it's fairly trivial for us now to acquire, sorry, I think I have an image there, but it's fairly easy for us to acquire image stacks that are maybe 10K by 10K by 1K pixels. But the question really is, what's next? I mean, does the biologist care about the RGB values in those pixels? Really, I think what they want to do is to ask semantic questions. They want to ask how many cells of a certain type are there in this particular data volume, but also across my lab's entire data collection. How many times do the yellow cells abut the cells in purple? Think about what Google Maps can do for you at this point in time. You can specify within a certain distance of a certain location how many hotels are available. If I want to move from point A to point B, what's the fastest way to get there? Biologists are essentially looking for tools of that kind, semantically expressing what they need, And then the system should sort of quantify whatever they have in their data sets and return it to them. As a discipline, biology certainly lags behind physics and chemistry. And really, I think if you want to help biologists become more quantitative in nature and then more predictive down the line, then providing them with tools that can automatically, do signal processing, noise reduction, segmentation, classification. So essentially, we need workflows that can do all of this in one shot, and then present all of these capabilities through a unified interface. So I think that's going to be really key going forward. Alex Gittins, I think in his next talk, is going to comment on one particular mode of imaging, which is called mass spec imaging, wherein you can acquire a spectra, a very detailed spectra for each single pixel in this image, wherein you might have a million channels, and you can record how many carbon atoms you have, how many nitrogen atoms do you have, so on and so forth, for each of those locations. So the data problem gets really quite challenging. You might imagine that there are maybe 1,000 by 10,000 pixels here, and now at each point I have a million dimensional spectra, and now I need to do clustering or dimensionality reduction in such contexts. That can be fairly challenging. All right, so moving from cells to genes, which in turn encode proteins, and that results in cells eventually. I would say that, again, this field has certainly witnessed a lot of progress in the last decade, to the extent that you can get your genome sequenced easily. So sequencing algorithms, assembly algorithms, I think are becoming more and more tractable. The frontier of at least sequencing and assembly problems in genomics have to do with problems in metagenomics. So you have a fairly complex environment, and you collect your samples and you do sequencing on them, but you do not know a priori how many specimens are present in that sample. So not only do you have to determine that, so what are the specimens, but then you have to uniquely attribute the genomic sequence to the collections of species. So metagenomic assembly is a challenge area. But I think going forward, really, in some sense, you have a genomic sequence. What do you do with it? I mean, it's just not good enough to have the sequence and call it a day. You need to be able to predict something. And predicting function is really key. So I think we hear a lot about personalized medicine, that you can get your personalized genome sequence, but you use that information to determine perhaps the medicine that will be most effective for you. There is a similar problem called personalized toxicology that Ben Brown, who's both in the UC Berkeley Stat department but also at Berkeley Lab, is working on, wherein essentially what we are trying to do is the following. So we have a space of chemicals in the environment, so there are synthetic chemicals, so on and so forth, and then you have a space of species. What you would like to infer is this chemical going to be toxic for a certain species? So this matrix of species versus chemicals, you'd like to fill it out, and you'd like to know, is this going to be harmless or is this going to be toxic? So in some sense, it's a matrix completion problem. Now, it's illegal, of course, to test all chemicals on humans. That's not going to happen. But in some cases, some chemicals may have been tested on other species. So there might be partial entries in this matrix which are available. So the question is, can I impute the rest of the matrix from these partial entities? So there are maybe two structures in this problem that one can exploit. One is the phylogenetic tree that relates species to each other. So perhaps susceptibility to classes of chemicals, we could use that information. But also in terms of chemicals, if you look at the structure of various molecules, the 3D structure, perhaps you could impute properties from the structure and see if some of those properties might carry over. So for example, if there are hydrogen atoms dangling off to the side of a long chain of carbon atoms, then chances are that those atoms right at the end of the chain are going to be important in terms of their chemical properties. So anyway, so Ben Brown, is working on this problem, and he's used random forests, and now I think he's looking at deep learning in capturing some of this structure and filling in this matrix. A similar problem, so moving from organic to inorganic. There's a lot of movement in synthetic materials right now. So if you cared about the most energy efficient photovoltaic substance, or if you cared about the substance that would be most effective in capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, how do you go about designing that material? The space of potential materials is 10 to the 80. There's no way that you're going to propose a molecule, simulate it out, because these DFT simulations take a week to run, and then you figure out the property of the material. So how do we go about exploring this space of large materials? So at the lab and at NERSC, we now have something called the Materials Project, which has essentially simulated 40,000 different materials. Scientists can come in, they can propose a new material to be simulated, and the computation is run on NERSC and a variety of other resources. So certainly scientists can access electronic properties of all of these materials. But given that, how do I choose the most promising next material? So it's basically a design of experiment problem. It's a fairly high dimensional space, and I just have 40,000 samples. Determining which portion of the space might be most promising is a challenge. So from materials onto atoms, and in particular subatomic physics, I showed you pictures of the LHC. These are particle tracks, so there is a fairly energetic collision that happens at this point in time, and then products of that collision spiral out and hit detectors in the LHC. So really what you see in these channels are images of such events. But what you want to get at is, well, a lot of these patterns are conventional collisions. So maybe it's a hydrogen atom, or some other collision that's happened. Because of the sheer amount of data that's processed, that's available in these projects, so tens of terabytes to sometimes hundreds of petabytes. Really, automated techniques are absolutely key. There's just no way that human beings are going to go through such long time windows to figure out, manually segment things out, classify it as one event type or the other. At the same time, we, of course, don't have a lot of labels either. So deep learning is the rage at this point in time, and for deep learning to work, maybe you need 10,000 to 100,000 labels. We just don't have that amount of label data. So getting deep learning to work in an unsupervised fashion is really quite key. And that's one of the things that we are also looking at the lab. All right, so I talked about 10 problems. If you talk to folks in the NSF, I'm sure they'll have a slightly different set of problems. But thinking more broadly about the landscape of data analytics problems in science, what I've done here is to arrange, when I talk to scientists and I figure out and I map it to our more conventional statistics or machine learning taxonomy, I hear them talk about classification, regression, clustering, problems, so on and so forth. And then along the columns, of course, are various domain sciences, so astronomy, cosmology, climate, and so on. And this is generally what the landscape looks like at this point in time. So, I just touched on 10 of these crosses. There are many more. A few comments. When we try to engage researchers, folks in the Berkeley Stat department and otherwise, typically they come in with, I have this really cool clustering algorithm, and do you have a problem for me? So then I sort of walk them through this table saying, okay, if you're interested in cosmology data set, then you're going to have 1 trillion points, and they'll just be 6-dimensional. If you look at mass spec imaging, then you'll have maybe 100,000 points, but each of the points is going to be 1 million dimensional. So you can choose, what data set makes more sense. So again, if you think that you have a great algorithm that needs to be, that you'd like to really try out, let me know, and we can sort of walk through this matrix, and I can point out what's unique to each of these columns. So that's one way of engaging. But really, I think what we would really prefer is if you work with us on domain sciences. So just think about climate science, and climate science has interest in classification and regression and design of experiment problems and so on and so forth. We think that for collaborations to work, it's a little more meaningful to work in this fashion, because I think there's necessarily a back and forth between you understanding a little bit of the domain science and then really understanding what the key analytics challenges might be. All right, so this is my take at formulating a research strategy based on these requirements. So we have a number of domain sciences at the lab. They require, I just put up 5 or so analytics tasks here, but there are 10, maybe more. Really, what's key is determining what algorithms are actually going to scale. So, I think order n squared algorithms are just not going to cut it for 10 terabyte size data sets or more. So there is a smaller class of algorithms that do have good scaling characteristics, and we are trying hard to determine what those might be. So typically, I think, I suspect that most of the folks in this room will sort of stop at that layer, hopefully develop your methods, show proof of convergence or whatever other theoretical property of interest, maybe apply it to a data set and stop. But, if you think about, if you really want this algorithm to scale, the hardware has some really interesting characteristics which are very complicated. So, the chips are many core in nature now. The memory hierarchy is deepening. There are issues having to do with moving data. There's power efficiency considerations. So really, this language of applied math and stat and machine learning is somewhat disconnected from physical hardware. So it is important for us to translate the language. So translate, what is the key computational or structural element in your algorithm, extract the motifs from that, and then work with Intel or Cray in designing optimized libraries which will do a good job at solving that problem. So if you take deep learning, for example, if I care about pattern detection, and deep learning seems to be, say, the most scalable algorithm, then really the motif that comes up is dense linear algebra, and I should note optimization. So figuring out what the right set of optimized libraries might be, maybe it's Scalapack. Intel now has libraries for introducing convolutional primitives. And then there are techniques to do hyperparameter optimization and distributed optimization, stochastic optimization. So these libraries then take the hardware into account. So in the DOE, we have a project called Mantissa, which has been working on the top 3 layers. And then going forward, we are going to establish something called a big data center to look at the bottom 3 layers in extracting the motifs and really developing these optimized libraries that will account for HPC hardware. All right, so I want to conclude on how you can engage. So I presented a lot of stuff, but really I think the objective is to point out that there is a host of interesting problems in science, and this is how you can engage with us. So first of all, if you'd just like to get access to NERSC, the one prerequisite is that you need to demonstrate some relevance to DOE. So in the ASCR space, developing technology and developing methods is its scope. And then you can pick science problems from a range of applied offices. You can apply for access to NERSC resources, so getting compute hours, 100,000 core hours is really not a problem. A few terabytes is not a problem. And then you can talk to experts in various technologies. So this is all routine. You don't have to go through me. You can just go on the NERSC website, get an allocation, and proceed. NERSC is going to shortly put out a call on large-scale data applications, where we'll encourage you to look at the right side of that curve that I was talking about. So you can be more ambitious in the kinds of problems that you might want to undertake. So this is all unfunded engagement. If you're interested in opportunities for funded engagement, then clearly it would be wise to think about in-depth collaborations with scientists. So there are, hopefully, these 10 problems give you a sense for the problem landscape, and the matrix give you an idea as well. You can participate in joint DOE proposals. So I lead a proposal called Mantissa. There are a few others as well. And this idea of setting up a big data center, the mission of the center is going to be to solve DOE's leading data problems at scale on Cori. So we would like to process 100 terabytes of data or more on 100,000 cores and more. So these would be capability applications. So if you're interested in demonstrating methods that can scale or scaling technology, let me know. All right, so in conclusion, this is the last slide. NERSC is going to be a central facility in the US to handle data challenges. We have science problems. I mean, the legacy of the lab is really around team science. We know how to do that. Hardware, in some sense, is easy. We have compute hardware, we have storage hardware, we have networking, we have interconnects. I think software is really where the problem is. So thinking about what the production stack is for analytics is a challenge. And then doing the methods research is really a big gap. So collaborations are absolutely key. And really, we invite you to participate. So I'm going to be around today and tomorrow. If any of this sounds interesting to you, please let me know. Thank you.